Hello. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. We're ready to start. There's no fire alarm scheduled for tonight, so if the fire alarm does sound, it's back out through the front door and down the ramp. Do we have any apologies for absence?
Just one apology, Chair. Chris Jackson, Steve Pearce is substituting for him.
Fantastic. Okay, so item 4, we've got, do we have any declarations of interest actually for tonight's item? Fabian.
Just in case it's relevant, I'm a member of the Cinema Theatre Association.
Could you be a bit more distance between your...
I'm a member of the Cinema Theatre Association, which may have some bearing on the first item. I retain an open mind.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so there are minutes of the previous meetings for approval. We have got 2 sets of minutes. One is from meeting in October, which was the deferred meeting following the death of the Queen. So there wasn't enough time to get the papers prepared for the committee afterwards, so we've got the papers for it now. Is everybody happy to approve those? Any objections? No. Brilliant. And then the second set of minutes is for the 7th of December, and there's one small typo at the end that I've spotted, which is that the next meeting today starts at 6:30 instead of 6 o'clock when it actually does. Any objections to approving those minutes with the correction?
And just to intervene, Chair, just had a notification from Councillor Windows. He's given his apologies.
Okay, thank you very much. I've been told that Councillor Pulteney is running late as well, but will be here soon. Okay, so next on to item 5, the action sheet. Gary?
I don't think there's anything from there, Chair.
Okay, fantastic. Do we have any appeals?
Thank you, Chair. Just on appeals, you'll recall last time around you considered the appeal against non-determination relating to the Brislington Meadows site. That appeal was already in and the inquiry dates are already set, just to reassure committee that the council's team has been busy preparing the evidence into that inquiry, which is now being submitted, and we're now looking at the appellant's evidence as well. And we're all due to start on the 31st of January at City Hall for day 1 of, I think it's 11-day inquiry. The only recent change was that we've been notified of a change of inspector. So we had one inspector who we had a case management conference with before Christmas, and the planning inspectors advised us last week that the inspector's now changed. So we've got a case management conference with that inspector on Monday, and that involves ourselves as a council, the appellants, Homes England, and also the Rule 6 parties, so the Tree Forum and the local group as well. So they'll be present at that, so we'll know more then. But certainly all ready to start on the 31st of January, and we'll keep you posted on that one.
Thank you very much. Keep up the good work. Could you also... Oh, yeah, Andrew?
I was just going to ask, I note that the hearing for Land at Home Gardens was held in November. Are we expecting to hear about that soon, and will you report that back to this committee? Absolutely,
because that was the decision made by this committee. I'm not aware of the decision coming through yet. Although the officer who dealt with the hearing, Peter Westbury, is on leave this week. But normally a decision like that would still find its way to me. So I've not seen anything yet, but as soon as we get that outcome, I'll share it with the members of the DCB committee and we can discuss it further at the relevant meeting.
Great, thank you. You literally interrupted by asking that same question. Terribly rude. Okay, does anybody else? Okay, thanks. You're not here set? Okay, if you're taking part in an item on the agenda, because are you objecting to... Okay, can I ask you to kind of go on that end, just so it's clear that you're not part of the committee rather than otherwise? Thank you. Oh, and you've left your drink. Thank you. Okay, does anybody else have any questions about appeals? No, great. Then over to enforcement, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just to report, one notice served since the last time the committee met relating to an allegation of change of use to a small HMO without permission. Another example of our focus in that area, resulting in some notices.
Fantastic. And actually, I forgot, I did actually have a question about, it's on page 29, it's number 21, about the Merchants' Arms in Eastville. There's an appeal for non-determination. If you could give us, I've had some representation about that. If you could tell us a little bit, it would be helpful.
Yes, so that was an appeal against non-determination. We have been discussing that with CAMRA, obviously a very interested party, both at citywide level, but also the local campaigners have been involved in meetings with us around that as well. What we have advised them is that we did, in order to seek to defend the appeal and present the council's case, we did seek some expert opinion on the viability of a public house there, and we received advice that I can't go into in detail, but it was to the extent that we couldn't sustain an objection at that hearing. That position has gone into the planning inspectorate, but also has a contrary view from CAMRA. So the planning inspectorate, I think, are busy kind of looking at all of that before they make their decision.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so then we're going to move on to the main items on the agenda. We'll have public forum first. I'll call up people. If you could come and speak into the mic, you've got 1 minute in which to speak. We operate a traffic light system. So when you've got your full minute, it'll be green, and it'll go to amber when you've got half your time, so 30 seconds. And then when it gets, so start winding up your statements at that point. Then when it goes to red, I'll need you to stop. We have read all of your statements in advance, so keep your comments kind of clear and to the point. That'd be fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, first up, we have Nick Haskins, please.
Right, Bristol City Council have lied, cheated, conspired to do everything that they could to pull this building down up on Filwood Broadway. They also said that they'd spoke to 60 people and they asked them to put a vote forward to say how many wanted the building and how many didn't. 49 said they didn't want it and 11 said that they did want it. Well, I've done my own survey, and I've got 2,000 people in Lower West that wants the building. There's children up at Filwood Broadway that are so talented, it's untrue. And we could use that building. We could use that building for arts and boxing and bingo, cinema. There's a lot of stuff that can be done in that building that we can make sure that the kids up in Lower West have got something, because at the moment they've got nothing.
Thank you. Okay, Michelle Tender. No.
I think she indicated she might not be able to attend, Chair. So,
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. Okay, David Hagan, please.
Thank you. This application seeks the redevelopment of the brownfield site to provide 30 affordable dwelling houses in line with the council's aspirations. The site is allocated for a mix of retail, business and housing in the adopted local plan, but not subject to any special designations. This scheme proposes an innovative residential development seeking to make the most efficient use of a brownfield site whilst utilising modern construction methods. The proposed housing would comprise 100% affordable houses with a mix of housing and apartments, which is in line with policy and will contribute to the council's objectives to set out its within its housing delivery plan. The scheme also proposes 541 square metres of flexible commercial floor space split across 2 units. The key benefits are the provision of 30 dwellings, 100% affordable housing, the provision of 541 square metres of flexible commercial space, 22% reduction in residual CO2 emissions, high quality landscape and improved accessibility and permeability, taking into account the key issues and those highlighted by the officer together with the clear material benefits of the proposal. It is considered that planning should be approved in line with the officer recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Tom Westwood, please.
Hi, I'm speaking on behalf of the applicant, the housing delivery team at Bristol City Council. The application is a key element of the council's drive to deliver much needed new build affordable housing in the city. This project will revitalise the site, which has lain derelict for some years, and provide 30 new homes in addition to the non-residential space at the ground floor on Filwood Broadway. That space will contribute to the activity on the Broadway through both the additional residents moving into the new homes and the additional floor space it'll provide for commercial or community use. This project forms a significant piece of the wider investment in the Filwood Broadway area, sitting alongside other projects both by the council and by others, which together promise to transform the area for the better. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll now move to the officer presentation. Colleagues, you've been emailed this earlier in the day, so you've got it to look at your laptops. Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll just start off just so be a bit, giving a bit of background to the site. So the large building, this is an aerial view of the site. Large building there is the cinema building. There's an area of land next to it which has been empty for a significant number of years. Couldn't actually find any actual use to that development of retail, business and housing on the site. It just to point out, not only does it include the site in question, you can see that big building there as a cinema. It also includes the rest of the rank of shops there as well. So the allocation promotes 1,000 square meters of retail floor space. It estimates 20 dwellings. It also promotes active ground floor uses that front Filwood Broadway, as you would expect, as it's a designated centre. And there are other elements that are promoted as well, which are listed in the officer's report. So I'll just outline the issues about the demolition of the cinema. It's a 1930s building. It became a bingo hall in the 1980s. It's been empty, as far as I know, since 1994. The building is not listed, and the site is not in a conservation area. So there's really limited control on stopping the demolition of the building. And it's classed as what's called permitted development. Prior approval was granted in 2019 for its demolition. And the applicant has 5 years to carry out that demolition. The applicants advised us that it's beyond economical repair and it's unsuitable for modern commercial, retail and community use. An application was made in the past to get this listed to Historic England, but it was unsuccessful, as was an application to reclassify the building as a community asset. So this is just this proposed layout. Essentially, we have blocks of flats to the front of the site, which will front Filwood Broadway. A new access road will be created. We'll have a row of townhouses, which will be 3-storey in height on the east side, and there will be 2-storey dwellings on the west side. Commercial floor space, as has been mentioned, is proposed on the ground floors of these units. There's also, because the applicant is applying for a flexible range of consent, potentially community uses, there is an outside space next to this building here, which could be used, for example, for a nursery. That's one of the potential uses that could occupy that space. So I'll just set out what the uses are. You've got 17 flats, 13 houses, 10 one-beds, 11 two-beds, 9 3-beds, all will be affordable. And as I said, the commercial floor space is 541 square meters, which will be a flexible range of uses. Class E, which is your retail, small office type uses, and then F1 and F2, which are for community use. So we've received a total of 8 objections, and there was one comment in support which just came in last week. The main issues raised were the loss of servicing and parking to the rear of units at that front Filwood Broadway and the rest of the terrace, which is also, that statement has also been made about that issue. There are issues about the new access road creating a sort of gap in the frontage on Filwood Broadway. There are issues about new dwellings having front doors right onto the new road, concerns with increasing traffic on the main road, and also a concern about no supermarket proposed because the area sits in the Knoll West regeneration framework, which does promote a supermarket in this location. So moving on to the issue about the access to the rear. So this is photos of the lane at the moment. So it's too narrow for actual proper residential use for development. So this is why that's going to have to be changed. And so as I mentioned, this is all, I don't know, we're not sure why, but it's all adopted highway. It's just a historic registration for some reason. So that's the rear yard. So you can see that's the image on the left is the where you've got the access to the existing retail units and residential flats above. As you can see, they store their refuse in this area for the flats, and then there's these larger bins for the commercial waste. And the applicant has addressed the issues of the existing residential and retail units and is proposing to provide a communal bin store, which will have 6 of those large storage for 6 of those large 1,100 litre bins. And that will be adjacent to the recycling refuse store for the existing residential units, which will be accessed, there'll be access retained by a footpath. Just to show you some elevations, so quite modern, contemporary in approach. Scale is deemed acceptable along Filwood Broadway, 4 stories, 3 to 4 stories. Materials are going to predominantly be bricks, zinc, and timber cladding. So just to outline, this is quite a useful image to give you an idea of what it will look like. Just the impact on neighbours is considered to be acceptable. We acknowledge there will be some impact due to the orientation of buildings, and there will be overshadowing of gardens, especially as it's due south of Barnsport Road properties. There will be some overshadowing, but we don't consider it to be significant. And also in terms of window-to-window distances, everything is beyond your typical 21 metres window to windows. In terms of highway safety, no significant objections were raised by the highway officers. There were 5 spaces to the north end of the site which raised objections from the officers, which have now been removed from the plans. There were concerns that visibility exiting the spaces would be difficult because of boundary walls by the spaces, so they've been taken off. There were comments made by neighbouring residents about houses having doors right onto the road. This will be a shared space, and as you can see, there is a slight buffer to the road, and there's also vegetation as well, that will have to be controlled by conditions to ensure that it doesn't grow over a certain height to retain visibility along the road. So essentially, officers are recommending the application for weighing up all the positive and negative aspects of the scheme. We are recommending approval subject to the completion of the necessary and reasonable planning conditions and necessary memorandum of understanding to secure fire hydrants, highway works, and the monitoring of the employment skills plan.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Alex. Okay, 2 things before we get started. Unfortunately, Councillor Pulteney wasn't here for beginning a public forum, so isn't unable to sort of take part in this item. The other thing that we have to say is I want to acknowledge to the residents here, thank you for coming, for your statements. We hear and understand your compassion and your strength of feeling about this building. Unfortunately, it already has the cinema already has got been granted permission for approval. And so, unfortunately, for demolition approval, and therefore that is not something that this committee can consider. And it is very unfortunate that it's not been listed and it hasn't been able to become a community asset. But we understand. Okay. Sir, no, I'm sorry, I'm trying to explain to you why. So, because we understand how passionately you feel about this, and we really do understand that. But unfortunately, this committee cannot consider, we can't stop that cinema from being demolished. Unfortunately, that is not something that is in front of us for consideration. It is really frustrating, and I am really sorry, and I'm just trying to explain to you before we even get started why the committee isn't going to be considering that, it's because we cannot. I'm going to ask Alex in a minute. Thank you. And I'm really sorry. No, at this point, no. No, if you want to stay, and hear what happens in this item, I have to ask you to not call out anymore. I'm being really quite considerate and lenient on you right now, but if you call out again, I will have to ask you to leave. Okay. We are very sorry about that element.
Excuse me?
We are sorry.
No, you're not. No, you're not. Just don't say sorry, you're not.
Thank you.
These people need so Marvin and all his crew, they're all the same, every single one of them.
Okay.
Yeah, well, you one of them? Oh, no, we're not.
Okay.
Are you?
Okay.
Well, you want to send somebody else to Norway West, you can check and see
Thank you.
what's going on. Because I'm telling you, there's
I'm really sorry. You have to leave now.
in Norway West is being squashed. There's kids out there got nothing. All they got is a five-a-side court.
No.
All they got is a five-a-side court. And I didn't let my dog run around in that five-a-side court because there's needles all in the bed. There's football pitches doing something away.
Sorry about that, everybody. Alex, could you just for one more time, sorry, Angela. Sorry, I keep calling you Alex. Angela, could you just go over the reasons for why we can't consider the demolition of the cinema before we get started?
If I pushed it. The building has prior approval for demolition, which was granted in 2019. It's not listed, it's not in the conservation area. There's little we can do to in terms of a demolition is considered permitted development, subject to getting a prior approval. And a prior approval application just considers the methods of demolition and the impact in terms of dust and construction management. So that prior approval was granted in 2019 and they have 5 years. The regulations allows them up to 5 years to demolish the building.
Thank you. So, unfortunately, we can't consider the demolition of the cinema as part of this application. So does anybody have any questions about the actual application itself? Lorraine, and then Andrew, and then...
Thank you, Chair. I just had... Can you explain a little bit more about F1 and F2 usage? Because I was hoping in my head that that would be a kind of compromise for the gentleman, but I don't know, I could be barking.
F1, F2 uses are for community uses, so like a community hall. You also have a nursery. So it's building a use that can be used by community groups. So for example, potentially a community group might have a film night or something like that. They could do that in the floor space as an example, but it's something it is available to the community, but it's a flexible use. So they've applied for Class E and F1, F2. It's just to ensure that they're not vacant, because there's a big issue in that area with vacancy. So someone may come along for retail use, for example, but there is the potential there for community users to use that floor space.
Can I follow up? So if a community group said, we want to do some kind of activities for the local community, and in regards to, say, somehow memorializing the building that was there, even though we know it wasn't listed, somehow just enable the community to be able to access. I'm being a little bit kind of, what's the word? I can't think of the word. I'm just considering the community and whether it's something that could be identified for the community specifically, as opposed to a nursery, because that would be a kind of leased kind of building, for a period of time. But would it be within the sort of parameters of the planners to sort of try and provide something for the community?
If a local community group is interested, that consent would permit that use on the ground floor of those two buildings, that front Filwood Broadway, so there is the potential for that.
Andrew.
Oops. Thank you. I was going to ask a question about, two questions. One was about the a retail space, a potential commercial space. So the the actual allocation in the local plan talks about retail convenience space of 1,000 square metres. This has 541 square metres, but notes that a chunk of the designated allocation isn't incorporated into this proposal. So what is the sort of existing usage of those shops? Are those what sort of mix of retail do we end up with? Is it fast food shops, or is it?
There's a lot of empty. I went up there a couple of days ago. A lot of the Broadway is empty. There's a betting shop that was open. There is a charity which they put a statement in. There's a charity there. I think they're called Rework, and I think there's a Woodland company called they're another charity group that help people. So there's a lot of vacancy there. And again, I'm assuming the floor space there is retail, so they could change. It's quite flexible now to change. But it potentially, I think there is scope in the future for redevelopment of that rank, but I'm not sure what's proposed yet, but that is a potential future development.
Okay, thank you. And the other question, actually, you've just reminded me I had a third question, but I'll leave that for the moment. The other question I had was on the biodiversity net gain and the off-site mitigation. And I was going to ask, is there anything that can be done in the conditions to make sure that that's, not in some far-flung place, it's somewhere relatively local to at least South Bristol, maybe?
I can't remember off the top of my head what the wording to the condition is, but if it's an issue, we could have it more. Do you mean sort of in the ward, or I think the problem with BNG, we're just getting around it, and the council have to come forward with suitable sites. So I don't know if it's such a great idea to limit to a ward, for example. I appreciate locally would be better, but I don't know if you want to add anything.
I mean, if it can't be done, it can't be done. But that's we've seen applications where the gain is going somewhere in like North Somerset or something, and it would be better if it's the more local it is, the better. Is I think the point I was making.
All I'll say on biodiversity again, I think the council's still working through its actual strategy on it. The 10% requirement is something that becomes live, we think, at the end of this year. And the council's putting together its strategy towards that. It's kind of working almost like cross-boundary as well, really. So it's kind of that, it's got that kind of scope to it, really, in terms of delivering it related to developments that are happening. So I think particularly for that reason, we shouldn't be limiting it to a ward basis. So I think the approach that's been kind of set out is probably the best one to take.
Okay, Steve.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is the one that Gary's expecting, because I always ask this question: is this policy compliant?
Happy to answer that question. The report sets out how the policy, how the application fares in relation to all the relevant policies in the local plan, and in particular, it gets a clean bill of health on that, or in the main, particularly in terms of housing delivery, in terms of affordable housing delivery as well. But on a site-specific basis, the key thing to look at is the thing that Angelo shows, the allocation. So knowing this with my appeal experience now, it's bringing this into I knew this anyway, but it's bringing it into sharp focus really. Once the council allocates a site in the development plan, you know, as local planning authority, we really need to stick to what's set out, and albeit it's something it was adopted in 2014, so quite a long time ago, but nonetheless, that's our development plan, and we need to follow the policies. So the things that the development requirements are set out specifically for this site, it fares well against. The first one is the contribute towards implementation of public realm improvements. That's something that is being sort of worked up separately, because the public realm improvements there are part of a wider strategy. So whilst this application in itself is not delivering that scheme in particular, it's still something that's kind of committed to and being worked through. So I would say that that's compliant with that. There's the buildings fronting Filwood Broadway reflecting the context of the area, including building line and building heights. I think it's fairly clear that's being met. Safeguarding the immunity of neighbouring residential properties. Angelo referred to the clear sort of 21-metre gap between properties. Providing active ground floor uses where it fronts onto Filwood Broadway. A number of the units that were within the allocation are actually being retained, which is a good thing, and there's also additional ground floor active frontages being proposed as well. And then finally, ensuring the off-street shoppers' car parks well connected to Filwood Broadway with strong and safe pedestrian links. So where do we stand on that, Angelo?
I'm not quite sure. The shoppers' car park, I think that's, I'm not quite sure where the shoppers' car park, I think it's behind the other side of Filwood Broadway. Yeah.
I always ask the policy compliance question because I like to flush those issues out, if there are any, straight away, because we can cut to the chase there.
I believe Philippa would like to answer a question. You're just trying to get your mic on.
Well, I just, in terms of loss, the unbalance, one of the unbalanced decisions is the loss of parking for something that isn't. It wasn't for residents parking or anything, and those retail units can still be serviced from the main road. So we advised that we did not think that was sufficient issue to be a consideration in your unbalanced decision, because your is normally about trying to get the affordable homes. So. But it was of a very minor, it would have been a very minor concern in any case, because there is an alternative.
Fabulous, thank you very much. Did either of you want to continue answering that question?
Only, I think, going through all that, as per the report, we feel that the scheme is policy compliant.
Great. As I say,
Okay.
I like to flush out those issues straight away if we need to. I've got two other questions. One is around, should we decide to approve this development, I'm thinking about whether there is servicing adequacy for both the new units and the existing units in this location.
So, in terms of servicing the existing units, here will have to be serviced from Filwood Broadway. So there's a scheme of works which the city design team, I think, and the council are working on to improve the Broadway. So that will have to take into account the servicing and access arrangements for those retail units. There will be retained pedestrian access to the back, and as I mentioned, there'll be, in this location here, there'll be a commercial waste storage area for the existing units, and residential as well, which is obviously next to the road and is probably looks a lot better than it does at the moment, just using that sort of yard.
Right. If we were to approve this, we might ask that that be suitably conditioned for that servicing. I wonder if you've had any representations from Bristol Waste or other waste contractors about the ability to service these?
We know, yeah, Bristol Waste had raised no objections. They commented they were happy with the number of bins and stuff.
That's great. And my third question, and I can work it out if you put the appropriate slide up on the, is around the net gain of bed spaces that this will afford us. You have got a list of how many bedroom units. Can we work that?
How's your maths on the dot? Okay, prizes for the first one that answers the right number.
59 bed spaces, is it?
There's no loss of residents.
There's no loss of residential. So it's all additional.
I'm looking at the uplift, and we can just talk about that when we discuss the
some of those rooms, they might be double bedrooms with doubles and singles. So to give you exact figure, I did actually have, I don't know why I deleted it now, but I actually did say how many people could occupy each one. But
oh, right.
So off the top of my head, I can't confirm, but the minimum, yeah.
Go on, Gary.
59 bed spaces. 59 bedroom.
Okay, all right, we're not shouting out the answers. It isn't actually countdown or something. Gary.
Thank you, Chair. And then just for members to give weight to, in terms of efficient use of land, the local plan allocation, where like a rough estimate of what number of dwellings or residential units will be delivered on each site is provided. At that stage, the estimated number of homes to be delivered on the site is 20. We're 30 proposed as part of this, so 50% uplift, which, you know, given its compliance in all other ways, is a positive outcome.
And just to say, I forgot to mention the density is 62 dwellings per hectare, which is compliant. We have a minimum density policy in the local plan, which says 50, no less than 50. So this is 62.
Great, fabulous. Fabian, you're next.
Yeah, there's discussion about the community, the sort of flexible space and what it could be used for. What's the sort of floor-to-ceiling height? Because that determines, if you're going to put film shows on, you need enough height to not have heads getting in the way of the projector beam.
I would have to look at those plans, have to find those plans. Off the top of my head, I wouldn't be able to say, and I've probably not included plans in the supporting documents.
Okay. Also, on the heating, how will these homes be heated and
So it's in the report somewhere, but all the residential properties are going to be heated via ground source heat pumps, and all the commercial properties, I understand, through air source heat pumps. So it's fully compliant with our heat hierarchy policy.
Okay, thank you. I'll have a question, Lorraine, and then I'll come to you. So when we talked about this in the pre-meet, we had a conversation about additional cycle parking. Has that been achieved?
What we discussed is by reducing those parking spaces, that could be optional extension of place to put cycle parking, and that you know that it was, we created more amenity space, and the new residents there, that could then be something that they asked for it to become a cycle parking place, but we wouldn't have asked for that to be specific because it had already met the criteria, our planning criteria. But when we discussed this in the briefing, that's my point, that by taking out those parking spaces which were a bit dangerous in where they were located, it does offer up that amenity space, and we were one of the options for those, but we would say that it would come from the new local residents, that they would want that space for that. But it is definitely something, and we could help them at that stage fund that if that was something they wanted to do.
Fabulous, thank you very much. I've got a quick question about trees as well. What's the net gain on trees? or loss of trees?
Yeah, that was something on the amendment sheet. I put 7 in the report, but there's actually 8 trees being removed. And there's going to be a total of 14 new trees proposed on landscape scheme, which will be conditioned.
So just to test your maths, how many, if we're losing 8 trees and we're gaining 14?
6.
6, well done. Okay, fantastic. Lorraine.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just add a sub-question to your question about the trees? Is it established trees that's going to be lost? Is it like, really trees that have been there for a long time? Because there's the difference between planting some little tiddlers versus, established trees and so forth. So that's just a by-the-by question that you can consider. But my actual question, whilst he's looking, is the officer sort of skimmed over the shadowing aspect of the buildings, because you kind of said there is a little bit of shadowing, but blah, blah, blah. So can you be a little bit more descriptive about who's going to be shadowed and how extensive the gardens are going to be impacted on, etc.? Thank you.
So the applicant, there was no shadow study submitted, but it's essentially because the property, the new buildings, so these are the new dwellings are south of these gardens. So essentially, you have the sun rises, it goes, rises in the east and it sets in the west. So essentially, you have shadowing from the south if you're directly north of a building. So there will be overshadowing in the gardens. But because obviously during the day when the sun moves, I don't think it will be a significant impact, but there will be some overshadowing. But there was no shadow study submitted, but we were comfortable with not having shadow study because of the orientation of the buildings. So there will be some, especially at the end of the terrace, the gardens here. I can't give. I was trying to find if I had an image of the trees. So I don't know, that's one of the trees, for example. So they're quite, lots of them are category U trees, but there are some C trees being removed.
Okay, so sorry, can I have a, so that needs to be clarified, I think, the tree thing, because I just don't want trees to be removed and then that have been there 20, 30, 40 years. That's the first thing. So I hope we can sort of, I don't know what we can do about that. And in regards to the shadowing, so I was just clarifying, so it's not shadowing by buildings, it's shadowing just by nature, as opposed to the building is going to create the shadowing. You were saying the sun, it's just due to the direction of the sun.
It's dependent on where the sun is in the sky, and it will be shadowing from the new buildings onto those neighbours. So this is south. These houses will be south of these gardens, so there will be some overshadowing.
Okay.
And it will vary depending on the seasons because of the position of the sun.
Okay.
But we don't think that impact would be significant enough to warrant a refusal of planning permission.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions or do you have any follow-ups on that?
Oh, should I say it now? Like, I just want to say that we need to have a shadowing survey thing.
Yeah, you've just said it, so great. Any more questions or should we move on? Did you have a question? No? Okay, right, move on. Who would like to have something to say about this application? Steve Wood, I can tell.
Someone has to be first over the parapet. So I've just done some quick numbers and I reckon that's a net uplift of 89 bed spaces. It's policy compliant. Servicing can be conditioned. We know that the provision of services to an area and the continued provision of services to an area is entirely reliant upon the number of people that might need them or use them. And as we're potentially putting more people into the area, the existing services there, the existing shops will see greater demand and therefore be more viable, I would suggest. So this could help access to services and shops for the existing residents as well as new residents. I'm happy to let people, other members, speak on this, but I'd like to test the mood of the committee at an early opportunity.
How very gracious of you, Steve. We are going to move to Andrew and then Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think there's a lot to recommend this scheme. It's a good-looking scheme. It makes use of a piece of land that's otherwise sort of quite inefficiently used at the moment. I have some reservations about a couple of aspects, particularly the impact on some of the units on Filwood Broadway itself, and in that taking particular note of the statement from Rework. However, I will be supporting the scheme overall.
Thank you. Fabian?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, I think it is a very nice scheme. You know, the images of what the housing will look like are really impressive. I do think it's highly regrettable that the cinema building is going to be lost, but there's a separate permission for that anyway. So if we said, oh, we're not going to support this because we don't want to lose the cinema building, it could still be demolished anyway, and we just have an even bigger hole in the ground. And what I would say, it's unfortunate that people, you know, that there's protests about losing the cinema now, nearly 30 years after it closed. Cinemas can be restored and rescued after a long period of dereliction. I mean, one I was thinking of, a very famous one, the Harwich Electric Palace, that shut in the 50s, was discovered in the 70s, much shorter time frame, and was then restored. This is like double the time frame. So, you know, 30 years of deterioration is an awful lot, and it's just a shame that people in the community didn't, you know, try and fight to keep, you know, get the building kept and repurposed in the mid-90s when it was vacant. So that said, I think, you know, as it's a separate permission anyway, there's not anything we can actually do to save the building. The question is what happens with this plot of land, and it's a good scheme. It's a very attractive scheme. I think the elevations are really impressive. What matters is the correct use of the flexible space and the other retail space, so that it's, you know, stuff that local residents actually want. I like the style of the buildings and the mixture of materials. Given I can't save the cinema, which I'd love to, I see no reason to oppose what is actually a very attractive scheme. So I'll be supporting it.
Thank you. Lorraine?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, I would like to reiterate, I don't think it is okay to not have a, what do you call that survey? The shadowing survey, not the sun, but the buildings. I think that's important for the planners to provide that information. I also think that I want some more information about the trees. I'm not saying that will therefore stop me voting for or against this, because obviously it is lots of positives. It's 100% affordable, which we have to take on board. But I do think that we need to consider the environment when we're looking at new, you know, some new buildings, because I think some of the buildings are going to remain. So I'd like to see that as part of the plan moving forward, that the developer should do that. And there was in Barton Hill, there was a building built, a pub that was turned into flats. I've forgotten the name of it. And they kept the Nelson's Arms, whatever it was, and they kept the bus that was originally on the building. So I would like to see, for the gentleman that was here just now, some kind of something from the old cinema kept to memorialise that building, even though it's not a listed building. I think that's something that's reasonable. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it would be quite I think it's very important actually that the committee kind of formally notes that it is very unfortunate that we're not able to consider the demolition of the cinema itself, because it's unfortunate that it hasn't been listed, and it's unfortunate that it wasn't granted community asset status as well. And I'd like to think this is the last time we lost a building like this of significance to Bristol, and I hope that going forward, Bristol City Council is actually much more proactive in supporting communities in saving these assets for the community as well. And I'd like to formally note that.
I agree with you, Chair, and I'd like to add that if a group were to come forward, even at this very 11th hour, with a plan to actually repurpose that building, we'd be open to it. I'd like to think we'd be open to it, although, you know, but obviously all we can decide today is what's in front of us right now, and that's all we can decide today.
Unfortunately, it is not in the power of this committee to save that building. Katia?
I do like the scheme and I like the way it looks and everything. I'm a bit hesitant about the flexible space because I do have sympathy with the man and his anger at the fact that there's nothing for young people in local areas. That's been something that in the last 15, 12 years has been completely decimated in Bristol, and that is an incredibly sad thing. And it would have been nice if that space was specifically dedicated for community and young people. But I know that we can't do anything about that. So hopefully the fact that it's flexible, maybe in the future we can do something about it.
Yes, it's going forward, it is critical that we do have these community spaces in order to have 15-minute neighbourhoods and meet our carbon reductions. Now, I can see that Steve is desperate to move on to the officer recommendation.
Yes, I would propose that we follow the officer recommendation and approve this application.
Okay, who is desperate to second that? Leslie, are you want?
I'll second that.
You want to second that? Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go around and I'll call your names if you could vote which way. So Andrew?
For.
Fabian?
For.
Katia?
For.
Steve?
For.
Leslie? For. Lorraine?
The caveat being my trees and the shadowing report, but for.
I mean, it's a yes or no or abstain question, so there's no caveat.
I'm going to abstain because I know it's going to go through anyway, because I just want those two things included.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. And it's a 4 from me, so that application passes. Thank you very much. A couple of moments just to shimmy everybody around and for the next items, representatives to come along. Thank you. Hello, I think we're all back. Okay, we're going to move on to the second item, which is Hobhouse Close. We'll start off with the public forum. So you may remember this from last time. If you come up to the microphone, I'll call you by name. You have 1 minute to speak. We've read your statements in advance, so sort of keep your comments clear and short as possible, because a minute goes very quickly. The traffic light system, it will start at a green light when you have the full minute. When you get down to half time or 30 seconds, it goes amber. So start winding up your comments, and then when it goes to red, I need you to stop. Okay, first up we have Councillor Steve Smith, please.
Hello again. First of all, I just want to say on behalf of all the residents who are here again tonight, thank you for a few weeks ago before Christmas taking their concerns seriously. I think that was very much appreciated. It's a shame that this has now gone off to the inspectorate and we can't get to a resolution tonight. I'm not really sure what anyone gains from that, but what I hope we can get from tonight is that the various enforcement functions around the council, whether it's planning, whether it's HMO licensing, can come into action here to make sure that this building is used in the future, regardless of what planning consent ends up being granted or not. It's used in the way that it was intended, in the way that the consent has been applied for, as a private residence and not as a long-term Airbnb. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Susan Holland, please.
As Steve says, it's not a grant or refusal.
Oh, can you speak into the mic a bit more?
Yeah, it's not a grant or refusal that we're looking at this evening. It's a question of what the council says to the planning inspectorate. At the moment, the planning officers are saying that you should be saying to the planning inspectorate that the council would have granted this application. But looking at the reports from the planning officers, starting with the report at the end of November and going through to the latest addendum, the recommendation is very clear, but the basis of the recommendation isn't. Bearing in mind that it's now going to appeal, so there's no urgency, I would ask you please to ask the planning officers to prepare a full report to come back to you at a future committee explaining the reasons behind the decision that they're asking you to make, because at the moment, on my reading of it, it just isn't clear. And I think from everybody's point of view, it needs to be. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Martin Jones, please.
I just wanted to sort of reiterate what I said in my last statement, but that's by the by now. It's gone to the planning inspectorate. I've just personally, I expect most of these residents have as well, lost total confidence in the planning department and the information they've been given out. And that's why we need some clarity for what they're going to be telling or passing on to the inspectorate. You know, for our own benefit, we need to know what it is. We need to act against that as well. So do these guys, form their opinion of that. So that's all I ask. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Les Rowe, please.
Good evening. Although this case is now with the inspectorate, this individual's action will still be seen by many as simply another arrogant attempt to regularize his flagrant abuse of this very same inspectorate's conditional approval for a two-bedroom dwelling house. In order to preserve the credibility and integrity in the planning system, we trust that in the meantime, we may feel completely confident that the council officers will tightly monitor and enforce all applicable rules and regulations without malice or prejudice, so that the appellant is left with no possible wriggle room in the future. This case recently attracted local publicity with front-page headlines in the Evening Post and online, and so we hope that this may act as a possible deterrent to any other unscrupulous speculator.
Thank you very much. Okay, Brian and Joan Griffiths, please. No, Brian and Joan Griffiths.
The proud residents of Hobhouse Close have always kept a smart uniform to our houses, and when we realised that a rather tasteless brick building was to be tagged on the end, we were not best pleased. We soon realised that the building under construction was nothing like the plans we had seen, and later we were told that the respective planning had been applied for altering things to quite some degree. Also learning that this included multi-occupancy. Worse still, the guests started to arrive and often were noisy late at night. They took up residents' parking spaces and littered nearby gardens with beer cans and other rubbish. Needless to say, we look to the council to do something positive in our favour.
Thank you very much. Nick Duro, please. Nick Duro? Yep, okay, great.
I had not realised what a grey and cloudy area the subject of planning regulations was. Nevertheless, in this instance, we have a developer who was, having flouted the planning permission granted, can apparently, in retrospect, say, having built it, can I keep it? Leaving the planning authority in a position to say either yes and fall in line with his agenda, or of course to say no and uphold the regulations as they initially were given. Please firmly uphold what was originally given.
Thank you very much. Sheila Miller, please.
This property was never built as per the 20...
Oh, can you speak into the mic, please, because we can't quite hear you.
This property was never built as per the 2019 appeal decision for a C3 two-bedroomed house. Instead, it was built as a pseudo-hotel for 10 guests in 5 double bedrooms with private facilities. I note that this issue is now going to appeal, and the developer has promised to cease the unauthorised use. Given his track record, I have no confidence that he will keep to this. Indeed, even an HMO of 5 people will have a materially different planning impact on the amenity of neighbours, e.g. parking, than a normal dwelling house. Therefore, the application must be considered with regard to the 5 bedrooms. The developer's actions must be monitored closely by planning and licensing, and breaches of planning control rigorously enforced. We do not want this to set a precedent for future overdevelopment in the area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paul Sullivan, please.
There's the mic. Okay. Well, as the councillor has already said, thank you very much for taking our concerns seriously at the last meeting. At that meeting, it became clear to me that the planning and licensing departments are not talking to each other about this property. It's also become clear from legal advice that I've seen that the legal advice the officers have given you, the councillors, is open to question. I'm no lawyer, but it can't be right for developers to seek and obtain planning permission for one thing and then deliberately build something completely different. So I'm asking you, irrespective of the planning inspectorate, to enforce the regulations that already exist rigorously and not simply believe that the developer will comply now simply because he says so. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else here that has put a statement in that wanted to speak, but I haven't read you out without your name? No? Oh, okay, great. Do you want to come up to the microphone? Oh, but into the mic before you start, otherwise we won't be able to hear you.
I regard the new recommendation to approve it still outrageous. Planning Control originally approved on appeal the building of a two-storey, two-bedroom residential family house, in keeping with the existing style of the estate. The developer then cynically built something not approved, three-storey, five-bedroom house in multiple occupation, not in keeping with the estate, for serial rental. If this is approved, Bristol City Council will be in effect tearing up the planning rules as well as ignoring the valid objections of the neighbours. This is supported by the legal opinion supplied to other neighbours. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Okay, over to you, Sam.
Thank you. Good evening. Up before you, I'll provide a short summary of the previous slides before dropping onto the recommendation. I'm aware that some of you may not have seen the previous slides, and these are available after the recommendation and can be brought up if needed. I have up here now photographs of the front elevation showing the deviations from the previously approved plans, in particular the bay window and the pillars not being installed as approved, and the size of the white band above the bay window. The proposed elevations, including a redesign of the bay window and installing pillars as were previously required. And these would be conditioned as, well, we would be asking the planning inspectorate to condition these if it was to be granted permission. The floor plans of the property up now showing the as-built floor plans, and these would be unchanged. And there's a short summary of all the accommodation in the amendment sheet as well. Dropping onto the recommendation, as you've heard, it's now with the planning inspectorate, and therefore the local authority does not have jurisdiction to make a formal decision. However, the committee today is deciding what would the decision would have been if we still had jurisdiction to guide the local authority's position in the appeal process. I would draw your attention to the legal advice we received, which forms part of the supporting documents in relation to the condition that was discussed during the previous meeting. This advice is that condition would not meet the required tests and therefore would be unlikely to stand up if tested by the planning inspectorate. Furthermore, it advises that the regulation of the property's use is best controlled through planning enforcement action, and that there are other means to control the impact, such as environmental health, for noise complaints. On the amendment sheet, you will also see that the property owner has confirmed they will be ceasing the unauthorised use of the property on February the 14th. Our recommendation to the committee is that had jurisdiction been retained to make a decision today, planning permission should be granted on the basis of imposing the conditions relating to the physical works and the advice note discussed at the previous meeting. In addition, the planning enforcement case would remain open and will continue to pursue the use of the property as a large HMO and for short-term letting, and would also secure the physical alterations to the front elevation of the property once the appeal is determined.
Thank you. Okay, so just to clarify as well, so on the 14th of February, it won't be being used as an Airbnb anymore?
That's what we've been informed, yes.
That's what we've been informed, okay. Does anybody want to ask some questions? I kind of do, but... So it's going to be sort of return to the rental market for sort of long-term letting, is that what you've been advised?
Yes, I believe that's correct. So I believe the property owners are retaining control from a letting agent they had an agreement with, and will be letting it out as a C3 or C4 use, as they would be permitted to.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Lorraine, then Guy?
Go on, Guy, because I'm trying to find... I got thrown out, so you can...
No, ditto. Apologies.
Okay, I'm going to go for Andrew, if you're both...
Yes, I'll go for it.
Sorry.
So
Just, and I think you've just alluded to this, but am I correct in saying there is still a HMO license for the small use in place on this property? Is that right? The small HMO license.
Yes, that's correct, which is up to 6 occupants.
And how does it fit with the space requirements for 6 people?
Well, it's been granted a license by the HMO licensing team, so I would have to presume it meets their requirements for the space standards and accommodation standards.
Are we confidently presuming that?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. You sound more confident in your presumption. Yes, okay. Right. Lorraine or Guy, you ready?
Yeah, yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm a bit confused. I am actually a bit confused. The proposed advice now. This is not where I think my document's gone because it didn't save itself. I think I've got a concern with the fact that I read somewhere, which I can't find, that the applicants are not complying with the change, to cease using it as it's been used. That's what I read at I think at the very bottom of the document, that they're still not complying with ceasing their current activities. That's one thing. So that's a bit of a worry if I'm correct, and I think it's page 75, I think, at the bottom.
I think basically there's been some update, hasn't there, since the papers were first published. Do you want to clarify?
I can try and set out what the breaches of planning control are or alleged to be. An absolute definite one is the departure from the approved plans granted at the original appeal. And I totally understand, as planners, we get really frustrated, as do local communities, when developers, whether it's a big development or a small development, depart from the plan without permission. It's really frustrating for everyone. It's part of the planning system, though, that someone who does that can apply and get seek retrospective approval for the same fee, which hurts. So, but that's the situation we're in. So what the local planning authority has to do is kind of dispassionately assess those physical changes, which is what's happened here, but also additional changes are prescribed by a suggested condition. So that deals with the physical sort of changes to the building, which are external changes rather than internal ones. And that's the one thing that's before you this evening, albeit it's not a decision you're formally making because of the appeal, but the issue in hand is the external changes to the development. Other associated issues that the alleged as breaches are it's been used as a large house in multiple occupation, and there's an ongoing enforcement investigation into that, which will continue, and also the allegation that it's also being used for short-term lets, which, whilst there's some ability to use it as that is also being investigated. We've received reassurances from the property owner that will cease and it will revert to either a single house or a small HMO very shortly. But obviously we're reliant upon local knowledge as to whether that happens or not. So in terms of the recommendation that we've got here, it's to say to the planning inspectorate, as a local authority, we would have granted permission for those physical changes. And also for yourselves, it's to reassure you that the enforcement case will continue and we will still be receptive to receiving evidence about both the large HMO and the short-term lettings, but on the understanding and the hope that those two breaches will cease really quickly. I hope that helps.
Yeah, so we're back into the hypothetical. We don't get to decide this, but it's a hypothetical what we would have decided had it been in our power. Yeah. Although arguably I'm not convinced we would have followed officer recommendation judging by I'm looking at the summary of recommendation, for example, and it says the use of the property as a short-term let would not be granted permission, and it was being used as a short-term let, and that's what we were considering. And then it's got permission to be used as a small HMO, but we've got evidence that it wasn't being used as a small HMO, but as a large HMO. So therefore, on that basis, with the way in which the conversation went last time, on that basis, I don't know if we would have followed officer recommendation.
So, Chair, I think the allegations of the large HMO and the short-term lettings, the property owner isn't asking us for permission for that. If they were, then the committee could take a position on both of those things, but they're not. So they have to be left to an enforcement investigation to establish are those things happening and are they unacceptable, and that would be an enforcement matter. So the issue before the committee is narrower than that. It's are the physical changes that have been implemented at the site, are they acceptable or not?
So because the applicant hasn't built or operated the thing that they got permission for, that's why we're currently looking at the retrospective application for the kind of cosmetic elements of it, even though they're also not adhering to the other elements of their prior approved application. So, but we can only look at one part of it, even though they're clearly going against many parts of it.
Exactly, Chair, because we can only deal with the application before us, or theoretically before us, which is the physical changes. The associated issues about, say, misuse of the property has to be dealt with as a separate enforcement matter, which it is.
Which it is, and you're on top of. Excellent.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up so I'm not changing my question. That was what I was going to clarify, because it's really important that we aren't joined up, as in planning and enforcement. So joining up will help to reduce that statement made by the public around opening up a can of worms, basically, if we don't control it, because so thank you for clarifying that, so that we can be assured that that is being pursued. Because obviously when were we here? I've lost track. 6 weeks?
Before Christmas, about 6 weeks ago.
Yeah, and if we're still finding that the system, they haven't ceased doing what they were supposed to be ceasing doing, then it does worry me a bit. But I'm rest assured that things are going to be moving forward. Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I've got Guy, then Steve, and then I'll take Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. There's an interesting piece of legal commentary in the agenda supplement that I just wanted to get the officer's take on. The legal note recognises that obviously listed alterations to dwellings which are not listed buildings don't require planning permission.
Can you do it more into the mic though, so we can hear you?
Apologies. Is that better? Thanks. But the legal note makes the point. In order to rely on Section 55(2)(a) of the Town and Country Planning Act, the 1990 Act, it would have to have been constructed in line with the permission originally granted. Is that the case?
So this is legal advice that's been put forward as part of public forum, so it's not the council's legal advice. We've had a look at that. We don't necessarily agree with that interpretation, but perhaps more importantly, it's a matter now for the decision maker, which is the planning inspectorate. So the planning inspectorate will see that advice and then factor that into their decision. So the inspector dealing with this will have to satisfy themselves that the application before them is a legal and valid one. We feel that it is, but ultimately, as decision maker, which is now the planning inspector, they will have to satisfy themselves around that.
That doesn't sound quite certain. That sounds like a judgment call, potentially, that the committee would have been entitled to take into account and come into its own view and could do now. Is that right?
I think because it's talked about as a potential area for legal challenge, then yes, it would have been a matter for the council when deciding the application. But as the committee is no longer dealing with the application, it's now a matter for the planning inspectorate before making their decision. just to emphasise that the committee cannot be legally challenged for the view that it expresses on the appeal, because it's not the decision. The planning inspectorate could be, because they are making the decision.
Final question on this point, but I just want to bottom out my understanding of it. But surely the factors that pertain to that decision would still be material considerations for this committee. So yes, the prospect of legal challenge wouldn't be one that this committee could bear in mind. But the principles underlying that could be. That is to say that one cannot rely on Section 55(2)(a) of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 for what is in effect the opt out or the excuse from having to have planning permission for internal alterations. Because in this case, this building wasn't constructed in line, it can't rely on that and possibly would have required planning consent for internal alterations. Is that the case?
Please hold the line.
So I think looking at the legal opinion that has been submitted, that I think that might have applied if the applicants here had applied under Section 73, which is to amend the plans of an existing permission, which we often bring to you. This, though, is a planning application in its own right. It's a stroke F reference number. The description is retrospective permission for erection of dwelling. It's not a amendment to existing plans. So technically, we feel that they've followed the correct procedure here. So the planning inspectorate will have to go through the same exercise. But even if it was us making the decision, the committee making the decision, I'd be advising you that they've made the correct application.
Okay. Second legal question, but on a different point of law. I just wanted to check around the use of the property for a short-term letting does not require planning permission, which is a really key part of the officer's report and the what's in front of us. It says in both the legal note that's been submitted as part of public forum and a few times in the officer's report that this is a matter of fact and degree. Is that right? I'm wondering what that can mean if what was a two-bedroom family home that has become a five-bedroom home that has become a short-term let isn't a matter of fact and degree. Am I misreading the law in this case, or is it... How can those two things be reconciled? If the need for sui generis change of use applies or not is a matter of fact and degree, and we've gone from an original consent from a two-bedroom house to a five-bedroom house to a five-bedroom short-term let, I don't see how much further along the matter of fact and degree you could go. Unless I'm misreading the law and that's not what it means. But that seems to me to be what it means.
It's a difficult one because whenever you say change of use is a matter of fact and degree, which it often is, you by definition you can't really define where that limit hits. So it's based upon evidence received at the time, and this is an allegation, and we'd have to receive monitoring information as to how much it's being used for those purposes. So I think the recommendation that we've put forward is that an advice note would go on any permission. So we would recommend that to the planning inspectorate, albeit now the decision's out of our control. I don't know whether that would go on. We did discuss at length a condition last time around, and I'm thinking on our feet we'd come up with some wording for that. But and you see from the papers, we've had that legally tested, and it's kind of failed that legal test, really. So it's one of those frustrating things where across the country, apart from London, there's very little control over these kind of things unless that use becomes excessive, but how you define that, who knows. So it's not really something that we feel that we could control through this application, or really the planning inspector. But again, the planning inspector can hear kind of representations on that issue, and the inspector, I think it's unlikely, but they've got the option of putting some firmer controls on it, but I wouldn't be too optimistic about that happening.
And final question from me. In terms of that, in terms of the wording of the legal advice that the council received about that condition, it seemed to me, again, and I would appreciate your characterisation of it, that the legal advice had concerns about the wording, but not necessarily the principle of the condition that was being applied. And it does strike me that there are a number of areas where there is more nuance and more flexibility than the original officer's report might have suggested around some of these points. There seems to be an awful lot of judgment calls being made. I'm just wondering if putting it to the planning inspector that condition or some suitable alternative might be a way of inviting the planning inspector to consider what would be considered enforceable and meet those 6 tests.
Yeah, so Councillor Portland is correct in that the specific wording of that condition was looked at, and it was appeared to fail the tests, and sort of almost inherently that kind of condition is likely to as well, but it would be possible to improve the condition, and we have done some looking at that. As I say, it's not our recommendation, but ultimately if committee strongly feel that such a condition should be put forward to the planning inspectorate, we'd be able to do that. Because ultimately, as a committee, you can, within reasonableness, make whatever decision you like, really. So if it's a decision along those lines, we can help.
Great, thank you. Steve, your turn.
Thank you, Chair. Gary has already said that planners quite often don't like being, I'll paraphrase, the same goes for communities, and certainly for this elected member, don't like having the mickey taken out of regulatory committees and processes. Looking at page 73 of our pack, the last paragraph on that page, in conclusion, whilst planning officers contend that planning permission should be granted, it may well be the case that the committee will be advised that it is unable to determine the planning application due to an appeal against non-determination. Which applies there? Are we able to determine this or not?
So no, the committee's not making the formal decision on this planning application anymore. The planning inspectorate is, but the planning inspectorate needs to know what the committee's stance on the application is.
Right. That's very helpful. My pause may not make it seem that, but that's very helpful. What we're looking at are some relatively minor adjustments to the exterior of the building. Am I right in saying that? I see nods. However, we do have the ability to pursue enforcement actions should we so wish, irrespective of the decision that is handed down by the inspectorate. Am I right in saying that?
That's correct. The planning, the enforcement issue, the usage of the property has got to be separated from the external physical things. But yes, and we've given reassurances that we will continue to pursue that.
Right, thank you. And I would say that this is a case where they should be vigorously pursued, because, as I've previously said, I don't like the mickey being taken out of regulatory processes. I'm concerned that the applicant hasn't ceased the unauthorised use prior to this coming here. I would have thought that doing so would have shown good intent. Am I making myself sufficiently opaque?
You are. Do you have a question though, Steve? Because we are still on the question stage of life.
Right.
We can move on to Fabian if you want to think about any additional questions.
I think we're in the place now where we're rapidly coming upon a discussion and a debate and the
We are, but
formulation
there are
of
some
a
other people who
recommendation.
we
So
already.
move
Steve.
on to Fabian.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Fabian.
Yeah, looking at the original proposals versus what was actually built. So there was a loft, there was an extra floor put in with a 5th bedroom, and the ground floor, which should have been a lounge, kitchen, diner, open plan, is a lounge, diner, kitchen, diner at the back and a bedroom. Do we have the ability to do anything about the use of the inside of the building, as in what the rooms are used as?
So again, whilst it's really frustrating for everyone, given the internal floor plans, internal changes aren't controllable under planning. So what the planning inspectorate originally granted permission on appeal was for a Class C3 house, and so what is there at the moment is still a Class C3 house. So we don't really have any control over those changes.
But do we have the ability to say you've got to change the exterior to how it was, what you had permission for? Or say that would be our decision?
Yeah, the decision in hand now, which is obviously the inspectorate's, but the committee can have a view on, is are the external changes acceptable or not?
Thanks. Then Leslie, then Andrew. Into the mic though.
I'm going to go on more or less what everybody else has said, and I do agree with Steve on a lot of things there. But when somebody, I know that the council will try to find an easy a way to put things right. But when somebody cynically applies for something and then builds something else, and then when he's told to stop, the action that he's taking that he hasn't got permission for, and he ignores that as well. At what point do we start to take some real reprisals against him? It's no wonder that these poor people are absolutely furious and have no faith in the planning system.
Well, Chair, I can only repeat really that, yeah, it's frustrating to everyone when someone doesn't follow approved plans, but unfortunately built into the system, which is a national system, we are duty bound to consider retrospective applications and assess them on their merits, no matter how frustrated everyone is, no matter how frustrated we are with the motivations behind that. We have to consider the changes dispassionately, but also investigate other breaches of planning control that are alleged, and we've set that strategy out. Really, we feel that the physical changes should be, reluctantly but nonetheless supported, and that the alleged changes of use should be continue to be investigated and acted upon if they continue.
Thank you. Andrew, then Guy.
Thanks. I'm just trying to think through or work through what happens at the planning inspectorate. So as far as I can tell, there's potentially 3 outcomes. If we say we advocate this advice note, the planning inspector may or may not take us up on that, may grant permission. If the planning inspectorate didn't grant permission, what would be the outcome of that? Or the offshoot?
Yeah, so if the planning inspector dismissed the appeal, felt that the changes were unacceptable, then we find ourselves with a further enforcement issue, because clearly we'll have a building that was not built in accordance and, as per the planning inspector, is unacceptable. So we would be duty bound to take enforcement action to redress those issues. But we'd have to cross that bridge when we came to it, really. But that's a potential future scenario. I think it's unlikely, but it could happen.
And how... I hesitate to ask this question because it's a bit hostage to fortune, so feel free to tell me that you can't answer it. But how likely do you think that they would be to take on board the idea of the advice note, given everything that's gone on in the past couple of committees?
Generally, the planning inspectorate, they will really challenge conditions. They'll only apply conditions that fully meet the tests. And I don't, to be perfectly honest, I don't think they'd add advice notes. It's not the kind of thing the planning inspectorate do. The council does it a lot for really good reasons, but for whatever reason, the planning inspectorate don't tend to add them. So that's an honest answer there.
Okay, Guy.
Thank you. No, it's just a quick question in relation to enforcement around, around enforcement. Is it how I was just looking back over the papers for this committee and briefly over the other committee as well. How many enforcement notices have been served over, say, the last year in this kind of incidents, as in the use of a property as an unlicensed HMO?
So in the enforcement section earlier, I did set out that we got one enforcement notice related to a HMO, which is the latest in a series that have been issued following the focus work on HMOs. So I haven't got a precise number, but a number have been served following the GNR scrutiny, first looking at the particular issue of HMOs. So I think we've made good progress there and served a number of notices, or seen the uses either established that they're lawful or seen the uses cease. So I think it's been a real positive bit of work, and it has included some notices.
How many times has use ceased? Because that seems to be one of the major concerns in this case, is that enforcement process has begun and use hasn't stopped. I'm just wondering how many times the council has successfully enforced a condition. Successfully enforced its own policy against an HMO in being to stop it from operating as such.
So there's a number of cases. I haven't got a specific number because I'm not prepared with that data, but I'd define success as the use ceasing either through as a result of the investigation and the property owner going, yeah, okay, I get it, I'm going to stop using it as a HMO, or it goes to the extent that they can demonstrate that the HMO is lawful through the period of time that they've used it, or in a number of cases where we've got notices served and there are a number of appeals running against those notices as well. So I think there's been a good deal of success. So in terms of the kind of the bundle of about 50 complaints that we were starting to work through a little while ago, they're almost all resolved now, one way or the other. So there's not, there's a hard core within there that we're having to serve legal notices to extract information. But there really aren't many now, or any, where there's unlawful HMOs where we're not actually taking one form of action or another.
Lorraine had her hand up, and then we're going to move on.
Just one more question, Chair. This is what I was alluding to before my computer crashed. The last sentence at the bottom of page 72, right? So I'm asking for clarification to make sure I'm reading this correctly. It says clearly, it says unfortunately, as the developer has not followed the previous approved details, the building does not have planning permission. I'm a bit confused because that was the bit I highlighted before I crashed. So it's saying that the developer has not followed previous approved details, so therefore the building doesn't have planning permission. I'm confused. So I'm just genuinely trying to clarify what that means, because it's saying it didn't follow the guidance, so therefore it doesn't have planning permission. Am I reading that right? I'm turning to Guy.
That's correct. So I think it's the previous owners of the site got permission on appeal to build a house on the plot, and because it was built differently, it doesn't follow that planning permission, so it doesn't have planning permission. So that's the only reason why this application is before you today. It's to retrospectively seek permission for what has been built in terms of its physical form.
So we could technically say no.
Sorry, I can't.
Sorry, we could. I've had COVID last year, so we could technically say we don't approve it. The retrospective application. Could we say that? I'm just saying, or not.
So the decision's now with the planning inspectorate, because it's been taken out of our hands by the applicants, which is their right. So the committee's decision is: would you have granted permission for the physical changes if it was still before you, or are the physical changes unacceptable and you would have refused permission? That's really the only decision before you today.
Yeah. So like a really simple, clear answer is we can decide that no, we wouldn't have approved this application in front of us if we want it. It's not our ultimate decision, but we can vote against this tonight if that's what the committee is minded to do. We're going to move on to the debate. What I do want to say is that this is a case of repeated failures to comply with permissions, and I take a very dim view of this, as I'm sure my colleagues also do. And apart from the impact on the local community, there's a reason why these permissions are there. Like, it endangers life when people don't follow these permissions. And heaven forbid what could have happened if you had 10 people in this house over-occupying it. It doesn't bear to think about it, and this approach is quite frankly appalling. I'm going to go to Fabian, because I know you've got your hand up next. And then who else's hand would like to speak? Andrew.
Yeah, I must admit, I mean, I'm slightly concerned if it's changed hands, so it was the previous owner who actually failed to comply with permission, and now it's been passed on to somebody else, and they basically got the mess to clear up. I don't know whether there's any way of this coming back to the...
Is it clear that the current owners are the ones that built it, or the ones that didn't get the planning permission in the first place? Because you can get planning permission, then sell on the planning permission, then somebody else builds it. So who built it?
We believe the situation is that the appeal permission was gained by another party, and we understand that the current owners then bought the site with that permission and built it, obviously differently to the permission.
So the current owners built it.
That's our understanding, okay. But I would stress that we can't judge kind of behaviour and motives behind this.
No. Okay, on the understanding that we believe that the current owners built it because they bought a plot of land with permission on it. I mean, my personal feeling is that, we should be saying, we should say, no, it's got to go back to the permission. I mean, otherwise we're just letting everyone, we can grant permission for something that really fits in well with the site. you know, I could get permission to build a building that's completely in proportion on a plot of land, completely in proportion with the rest of the area, and think, blow this, I'm going to stick a three-storey carbuncle on the site, and it'll get, you know, in a good chance of getting away with it. And I just think that's, you know, not the right way to do things. I take the same dim view that others in this committee have already expressed, and I think we have to say, you know, if you've got permission to build it to look like this, that's what you build. That's that. Or you come back for a fresh application. Or you come back for a fresh application because you actually think, no, I don't want to build that, I want to build this, in which case you come back to us and say, I want to build this instead. And if we say, okay, go ahead and do it.
Firm agree. Andrew, and then Katia.
Yeah, I find this very, very frustrating, as everybody else has. And we're in the position which I feared that we'd end up in when we deferred last time, which is, you know, with the decision taken out of our hands, which is regrettable. With regards to how I'm going to vote, I'm still undecided. I don't know. We're in damage limitation territory, I feel, and I'm not sure which way is the best way to vote for the best decision for this committee to make vis-a-vis it then being going on to the planning inspectorate and being taken into account there. So, yeah, that's where I'm at the moment.
I just, with all the stuff that's been going on and being said and all the confusion about what you're allowed and what you're not allowed, I find it really mind-numbing that someone can do that, change something from... I mean, we've got to remember these are not just buildings with windows and doors and solar panels. These are homes, and they're homes for either families, they're homes for single people, they're homes for whatever. And if you're going to ask for an extension to get a home for what is essentially a family home, and then you're suddenly going to change it into something that's completely different, I'm not even going to go with the Airbnb. I'm just going to go with the next steps, which is an HMO for 6, which I know you call them long-term tenancies, but there are high turnover tenancies, if we can say that, HMOs. That's the nature of them. I would have to say that I would disagree with it because it's not doing it in the spirit of what they put the original plans in for. I don't know whether they planned it that way originally, thought, oh, they can get away with it, or whether they just thought, oh, I need to make some more money. Or I don't know. It just sounds very not right to me at all.
Thank you. I think in terms of trying to decide what we would have done, because that is what we're looking at doing, thinking about how the conversation and debate went last time, there wasn't a huge amount of enthusiasm, and we ended up deferring it in order to get a more robust legal position. I think I don't think minded to support the application last time. I'm not any more enthusiastic about supporting the officer's recommendation, even if it's hypothetical, this time round. If nobody has any particular things that they want to say, or whether or not they want to kind of talk it over a bit more, we can maybe test the officer recommendation to see if you are minded to follow the officer recommendation or not.
I do think the dilemma has been, sorry, Councillor Pearce, I think the dilemma is, as it's been described from Councillor Brackles and Councillor Brown, that if we go against it, some other person that doesn't know the community or necessarily is looking at it, you know, in total black and white, could come back and totally overrule us. But then if we agree with it, we will still be... the opposite could happen. So we are in a dilemma, and I'm going to vote against it. I mean, against officer recommendation. I'm in a dilemma. I'm going to stick to my guns.
Because equally, if we vote to say that we would support officer recommendation, it makes it more likely that the appeal process is going to approve it. So, like we say, that's the dilemma. Do I have a second for the officer recommendation? or was that you wanted to speak, Steve?
I wanted to speak before you tested
Oh, you speak then.
the mood of the committee. Gary, is your recommendation that we approve the limited external changes in this planning application and a form of words to the planning inspectorate regarding the appeal? Because I would like to separate the two. Is that, I'm sorry, Chair, is that clear?
Not particularly.
I'll have another bash then. No, actually, I won't have another bash. Gary, do you understand what I'm saying?
I'm sorry, I don't.
Right, okay, I'll have another go. So, is this application, are you asking as a as part of your recommendation that we propose a condition to the planning inspector that relates to the prior permission rather than this one that's in front of us? I'm not sure that's any clearer, actually.
The one question you're in these circumstances, because the final decision's out of your hands now. The one question you're kind of trying to answer to the planning inspectorate is, would the committee have granted permission for the physical changes? And I think your options are to say yes, and we have got nothing further to say on the matter. Yes, but we would, for example, want something to do with short-term lettings as part of any future permission, which might be an advice note or could be a better worded condition. Or you could say, well, no, we don't accept the physical changes to the property, but you need planning reasons to do that, and just to help you out, that probably be on the grounds of good design and context.
Yeah.
So those are your options, really.
Yeah, because that's also where we've kind of become a little bit muddied, because even though we can't really decide on the basis of its usage and the size of it and how all the internal stuff, that's what all of our conversations about and the presentation, whereas really we're talking about the pillars on the outside, which actually is really annoying that they don't match the rest of the conservation area. And I would be minded on that basis not to approve it, because it's not that hard to make the windows the same size as the other ones and the pillars the same as the other ones. Like, it's really annoying that they haven't. So on that basis, I also wouldn't be approving. It's fine to make it all slightly irritatingly different down the other end of the terrace. So I think on that basis alone, I can legitimately say, no, I wouldn't have voted for this application. And we can backtrack to that if we like, as much as we want, and say, could you possibly bring up some, do you have any pictures to hand about what it should have been? And
These here are the approved plans that were approved on appeal in 2019, I believe it was, but the application reference at the top, it was a 2018 application.
do we have a picture of what it actually looks like? So it's a different shaped window and there's no pillars, and then the beam is a different size, isn't it? Is there anything else there?
Yes, and the bay window was not cantilevered. It was, as you can see here, there's a wall underneath the bay window.
Any particular thoughts on that?
I would like to propose that we reject the officer's recommendation and insist that the property is put back to how it was, back to how it should have been when permission was granted.
I fully agree. Guy?
Apologies, Chair. I have a number of points to make. I was going to see whether I'd have an opportunity to speak after you'd called vote based on the officer's recommendation or not.
Yeah,
Well, yes,
what,
Chair.
I mean, I can ask if anybody wants to second it, and then nobody can second it, and then it falls, and then we can move on. Would anybody like to second it? No. No. So the officer recommendation is, had it been in our gift to decide this, to approve. Now, do we want to vote to approve it?
Nobody seconded that.
Nobody
so
seconded
I
it.
proposed that we rejected the officer's recommendation, so it should be built, it should go up as built, as permission, you know, it should be...
Yeah, so just for absolute
corrected.
clarity, Fabian, so just sort of interrupting,
That's okay.
so everybody on the committee is clear. Process is we see if the officer recommendation would be passed by the committee. I'm proposing that we move the officer's recommendation. Because no one seconded it, we can't then take that vote because nobody wants to. Therefore, Fabian is now proposing that we reject the application, and I'll let you expand on those reasons.
What we'll say is that I'm proposing that we vote to say to the inspectorate that we would not have granted permission and that we would have insisted that the building was put right and so that it complies with the permission as granted on appeal. That seems to me the obvious, response. Otherwise, we're just going to let everybody build what they want, regardless of what the permission says.
Yeah, exactly. So I note that Lorraine has seconded that, but before we move to the vote, we'll let Guy speak, and if anybody else wants to say anything in particular, we can.
I think, Chair, we move to the vote. If there's been proposed and seconded, we have a vote, surely.
We can do, but before, I did tell Guy beforehand that I would let him speak before we did do that, so therefore I'm going to let him. You would want to speak if you were desperate to, so you'll keep your comments short, though.
I'll do my best, but I think you might want some basis to give to the officers for pursuing that line of thought. Now, I'm hoping the committee's all in the same place. I think we're in a place where we're minded to find today that we would have said no. I think the basis for that could be varied and could be fairly wide, given the breadth of the discussion that we've had today. We have a legal advice back from, was it independent or from the council on the condition or the advisory note that the previous iteration of this committee wanted to try and develop?
The advice was specifically on the condition, but of course that's only in the event that permission was going to be granted.
Yes, but my question was from that from in-house counsel, or was that from...
Yeah, in-house. Yeah.
Okay. In that case, I think that the basis upon which this committee would have turned this down would have been roughly along the following lines. I think the changes to the exterior are radically different from the original planning application that was made and the consent granted by the inspector previously. The windows look dramatically different. It's a highly symmetrical bit of architecture in terms of being a complete piece, and that looks radically different from both the other houses there and from what was applied for and granted by the planning inspector. I am not as certain as the officers on the two legal points, that is to say the necessity of a sui generis use for the HMO and the need for planning permission for the internal arrangements of the building. This is not an alteration to an existing building with planning consent. This is an alteration to a property that was constructed in violation of the planning consent granted. And I think more legal advice would certainly be welcome. I also think that the content of that note, that advisory note that was drafted, could have been more robust in terms of wording, so that it was something that was legally enforceable based on the principles that this committee was considering it in the first place. I think it would be good to let the inspector know that this committee would have sought to strengthen that note if we had been willing to grant permission. And on those bases, I think the committee would have said no. I certainly would have done. I think the rest of the committee would have been with us. And just as a very final note, Chair, and then I promise I will shut up, but the objections from the residents that are here today seem to be based around the use of this property as an HMO, at least in part, and those problems seem to stem from significant issues of noise, disruption, the constant use of the property by temporary occupants who really have little care for the environment in which they've been staying temporarily. Those are all enforcement issues. Those are all issues that the council failed to take action on in a sufficiently robust way to stop them from happening. And even now, as we're going on, enforcement action has begun against the current operators of this property, and no change has been made to their behaviour. And I think whilst this is not a matter for this committee, it is something I notice a cabinet member is present today. This needs to start being tackled in a way that's serious. This committee needs to be able to rely on the advice of its officers. And at the moment, I think that's in question when it comes to HMOs. So that's my recommendation. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Is that enough to go on for your...
It is. Sorry, I don't understand the reference to officer advice on HMOs, but ultimately, though, if the committee are saying that the permission should not be granted, that's where it ends, because, you know, you're not talking about adding a condition on or an advice note or restricting use of HMO, because until somebody grants permission for a house on the site, it doesn't exist in planning. On the condition, we note what's said there. So if indeed the committee resolve that it would have refused permission for the physical changes, and thank you for the detailed explanation about the merits of it. With any appeal, the local authority has to say, without prejudice to its case, if permission is granted, what conditions would you add? We can add, as a suggestion, a more robust short-term lets condition, and see what the planning inspectorate do with that. But the primary case the council would put forward is that permission shouldn't be granted anyway.
Great, thank you. Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so we are now going to take the vote. As moved by Fabian, seconded by Lorraine. I'm going to start over here. This is to reject the application. Guy.
4?
Yes. Lorraine.
I'm going to say 4 because I'm rejecting the application. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a double negative. It's very confusing. Lorraine? Not Lorraine. Leslie. Okay, that's a 4 from Leslie. Fabian?
4.
Katya? 4. Steve?
4.
Andrew?
4.
Thank you very much. Also a 4 from me, so that's your unanimous rejection of the application. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and see you next time.